Aviation's an experimental industry, to put it mildly. You don't get from not existing to breaking the sound barrier in just 50 years without some ingenuity and a slightly carefree attitude towards health and safety. But what's interesting about aviation is that despite being a resource-intensive industry, it gets a lot of room for messing around with crazy ideas, and more of those ideas than you might expect manage to make it from design documents to the actual runway. Today, having gone through an obscene amount of aviation research in the last few weeks, we found quite a few designs that raise a few eyebrows, and it felt wrong to just let them sort of fly under the radar, if you will. So today you'll be getting the story of how and why they were made. These are some of the strangest experimental airplanes that have ever been made. Wings are important for flying. Yes, it's a bit of an obvious statement. Thanks for noticing, but it's important to establish that when we're talking about the first entry in today's video. That's because a simple photograph will tell you that it's all about the wings with this one. Now, a bit of background before we go on. It's the 1980s. US President Ronald Reagan has done the whole evil empire bit with the Soviet Union, and relations between the US and the USSR, well, they're at one of their lowest points in the entire Cold War. Evil empire will kind of do that. Reagan has also made the call to start pumping more money into the armed forces, and some of that money is diverted towards R&D. Alright, so with that established, a team was put together consisting of a few giant groups, from NASA to aerospace company Grumman to the US Air Force, to test a really interesting theory. The theory was, what if we get a plane and stick the wings on backwards? And so it was in 1984, a test flight was flown of the prototype plane designated the X-29 to explore the theory of so-called forward-swept wings. It didn't crash, which counts as a success when it comes to experimental planes, and testing continued up until 1991 when the program was eventually discontinued. So, this begs the question as to why would they do this? Why would you say, oh, look at that plane, let's stick the wings on backwards and see if it flies? Did it actually accomplish anything? Well, first and foremost, it has to do with airflow. Wings, as we established with our first salient point, are important for flying. That's because as the plane moves, air flows over the wings and that generates lift. How airflow works on wings is fiendishly complex, too complicated to explain in this video. There's lots of maths and equations and words like vortices involved, and we'll avoid all of that. We'll put it over there and ignore it. Wings make planes fly. Simple. But thankfully, for our purposes, we only need to know a few things. First, when air flows over a wing that's at an angle, some of that air is deflected. For a normal swept wing, like you see on most jet fighters, the air is deflected away from the plane. For a forward swept wing, however, like the X-29, the air is instead directed towards the plane. So what does that all mean? Well, to answer that, we need to talk about stalling. This is when an aircraft experiences a lot of lift, which can result in a crash. Again, because of how airflow works, stalling doesn't happen all at once. Instead, it tends to start at the tip of the wings and move along them. That's important because the ailerons, the part of the plane that controls rolling, are generally located on the wingtips of the plane. As such, when a plane starts stalling, it will usually lose control at the exact moment when everything needs to be working perfectly. That was the issue that the X-29 was intending to fix. For a backwards-facing wing, the airflow is deflected in the opposite direction. This has the side effect of causing the stall to start at the base of the wings rather than at the wingtips. This keeps the ailerons active, which gives the pilot precious time to regain control of the aircraft and get out of the stall before the plane starts careening down towards the Earth. Okay, so did it solve the problem? Well, yeah, it did. But it also introduced entirely new problems because, well, that's how engineering works. The most glaring problem with the aircraft was that it was unstable, unbelievably unstable, sort of like a big new video game on launch day. Part of this instability came from the inherent design of the plane. The wings, you'll notice, are positioned further backwards along the plane. This messed with the plane's center of gravity, so already the aircraft was fundamentally unstable. Originally, this was touted as a feature rather than a bug. Of course it was, since the fact that the plane could turn incredibly quickly was thought of in terms of high maneuverability. Granted, that maneuverability was only possible because of a flight computer that was making 40 corrections to the flight path every second. But, well, hey, you can't hold technology against them. As time went on, the assertion didn't hold up to tests, as it became clear that, number one, other aircraft could match it in maneuverability, and number two, the plane would absolutely tear itself apart if the flight computer ever failed. One historian for NASA went so far as to say that the plane was literally unflyable. For those reasons, the program was discontinued, and the idea was shelved as impractical. Parts of the X-29 do live on. See, the wings weren't just more unstable, but they were more fragile as well due to the higher amount of stress being placed upon them. As such, they needed to be reinforced, but making them out of metal would have made the plane too heavy. So the engineers used some advanced materials such as carbon fiber and graphite epoxy. These are part of the same group of materials that make up modern stealth planes today, including the F-22 and the F-35. So in a way, the X-29 was the precursor to the 5th generation of jet fighters. And America was not the only one to test this theory. Russia had its own forward-swept wing prototype, the Su-47, which was originally meant to be constructed around the same time as America's, but it was put into limbo when the USSR collapsed. It finally flew, however, in 1997, only to confirm that, yeah, it was just as unstable as when America tried it, but it does look really cool. We're still on wings in this entry, and we're still with America. We are, however, going to go back in time a few decades to when America first started running experimental airplanes. With that in mind, in the years immediately following World War II, America had confiscated a lot of science, and indeed scientists, from the former Third Reich on everything from nuclear physics to rockets to aircraft. In terms of aircraft, the US recovered a prototype plane called the Messerschmitt P-1101 from an experimental facility. The design was a jet fighter that, interestingly enough, could change the sweep angle of its wings mid-flight. That was the vision behind it, at least. The plane itself wasn't finished. But the US was intrigued by the idea, and in the early days of aviation experimentation that the Cold War was known for, this variable sweep wing was one of the first ideas that was seriously tested. 6 years after the plane arrived in America, the Bell Aircraft Corporation had finished studying the design and had come up with their own prototype, the X-5, which took its first flight in 1951. The plane had 3 sweep positions for the wings at 20, 40, and 60 degrees, which it could switch between at any time. But now you might be wondering, well, why change the angle of the wings at all? Again, this has to do with airflow. When the plane is on the ground or moving at low speeds, a wider wing is better as it produces more lift and reduces drag. But when the plane approaches the speed of sound fast enough, a more narrow wing is preferable as it reduces a different kind of drag. The design, if it worked out, would allow for the best of both worlds. And rare enough in aviation tests, it absolutely worked. Despite problems with controls and the layout and positioning of parts, the actual concept it was designed to test proved successful, and variable sweep wings were concluded to be practical for aircraft. The direct descendant of the Bell X-5 was the F-14 Tomcat, which included variable sweep wings and was, by most accounts, a perfectly satisfactory fighter. Today, variable wings have fallen out of favor since they require some very specialized mechanisms that weigh down the plane and make it more expensive, but some variable wing planes are still in use. The Tupolev 160 bomber has variable wings, and the F-14 is still in use by many air forces around the world, including, funnily enough, the Iranian Air Force. Throughout the history of aviation, many plane designs have been referred to as flying tanks. The Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik, the American A-10 Warthog. Generally, this is because the planes are quite durable and can take a number of hits before being shot down. Well, we've got no time for metaphors today, so here we present to you a literal flying tank. The Antonov A-40 was a Soviet experimental plane that was tested to see if it was feasible to allow armored vehicles such as a tank to be flown into battle. It wasn't, but let's tell the story anyway. It's 1942, and it's Hitler's time in the Soviet Union. Germany has attacked and occupied large parts of the western part of the country, and there's an ongoing guerrilla war between the German armed forces and the Soviet partisans. But the partisans are rather outgunned, having only rifles and explosives to work with for the most part. Well, some mad lad by the name of Oleg Antonov came up with the idea of, why don't we just go full Battlefield 2042, a century before 2042, and airdrop some tanks in for them. The Soviets had a bomber called the TB-3, and one of these was modified to be capable of carrying a glider that in turn carried a T-60 light tank underneath it. It was envisioned that this plane would be able to carry the payload for a long distance and release the glider, which would then glide, interestingly enough, to the ground and deploy the tank behind enemy lines. So, did it work? Well, no. The tank was too heavy for the plane to fly, as one might expect, and so the load had to be lightened by removing the gun, and the ammo, and the headlights, and the crew, and the gasoline. Which, well, doesn't really leave you with much of a tank, does it? The point is, even that wasn't enough. The test plane had to ditch the glider to avoid crashing. Although reports indicate that the tank itself was surprisingly aerodynamic, which is not a sentence that we'd ever think that we would say. It wasn't even the fundamentals of trying to fly a tank that doomed the project. Tanks themselves were rapidly being upscaled, and a light T-60 would have next to no chance against a German medium or heavy tank. As such, even if the project worked, it wouldn't have had much practical use, adding the fact that all of the removed bits, the gun, the ammo, the crew, etc., would have to be parachuted in separately, and, well, that leaves you with a big why bother. The project was cancelled. Today we can actually parachute vehicles. America does it with Humvees. We're not quite to the point of video game gimmickry yet, but keep your eyes to the sky for flying tanks, and have your complaints to the devs ready. We're still in 1942 for this entry, but instead of Russia airdropping tanks, it's America flying a pancake. Our story starts in the 1930s when an aeronautical engineer by the name of Charles H. Zimmerman came up with a concept that he called a discoidal aircraft. Discs is the key word here, as you might have gathered from the photographs that you are seeing. The US Navy developed some interest in the project and gave Zimmerman resources to design a prototype in 1939 with full tests beginning in 1940 to 1941. Now, what's interesting about this plane, aside from the, whole flying pancake part, is the two massive propellers at the front. These propellers actually served an important purpose, and like the X-29 from earlier, it's all got to do with airflow. There's a force in aerodynamics called lift-induced drag, also known by the much cooler sounding vortex drag. Sort of sounds like the name of a Formula One team. But anyway, vortex drag happens when airflow is redirected, creating vortices. Drag, bad for aerodynamics, and it's in the interest of engineers to try and limit it as much as possible. The simple explanation is that the propellers of the V173 cancelled these vortices out, reducing the drag and thus allowing the wings to be much smaller than they otherwise would have needed to be. This made them both stronger and allowed the plane more maneuverability. It's solid stuff, really, but it's solid stuff on a really creaky table that's going to collapse. The disc design created some issues for the plane at low speeds, which necessitated some extra designing to work around it. What's more, the airframe of the plane acted as a giant air brake when it pulled into a high angle of attack, which is something that pilots tend to do a lot when, dogfighting with other pilots. This limited the aircraft's maneuverability and made it more predictable in any envisioned flight. It did fly, though, at least, and it served as proof of concept for Zimmerman's discoidal aircraft frame. As such, it was requested that he design an updated version based on what they'd learned. What he came up with was the Vought XF5U, which would prove to be much less successful than its predecessor. It never even managed to get off the ground since it was larger and made entirely of metal. The V173 was made of wood and canvas. In fact, the XF5U was so structurally solid that when the project was cancelled and it came time to scrap it, it had to be destroyed with a wrecking ball, which counts as some sort of achievement, we would guess. Alright, so we've saved the weirdest plane for last today. That's how we do viewer retention, people. And it's America, once again. Surprise. But before we talk about America, let's have a quick chat about Germany. In 1942, an engineer for Blom and Voss named Richard Voigt made a design to solve a specific problem. And bear with us here because we're going to retread a tiny bit of the video from earlier. Jet planes were just coming into production and engineers created the swept wing to help deal with the high speeds that they could reach. But sweeping wings come with their own problems, particularly at low speeds during takeoff and landing. Variable swept wings were proposed, but as we've said before, they were complicated and they weighed down the plane and also super expensive. So what did he do? Well, Voigt came up with a middle ground. He designed something called an oblique wing, a variable wing that would have one wing sweep forwards and the other backward. He thought that he had found a perfect middle ground solution. At low speeds, the wing would be perpendicular to the fuselage, providing better performance for takeoff and landing, and at high speeds, the sweeping of the wing would reduce the drag. But it gets better. There are different types of drag, it turns out, and an oblique wing could theoretically deal with both of them. At low speeds, the aforementioned vortex drag is the most important kind, and longer perpendicular wings help reduce its effect. This is why glider planes have such long wings, but at high speeds, so-called wave drag becomes more important. This is the drag that forms as a result of the shock waves from sonic booms. These shock waves are in the shape of a cone, starting from the nose of the plane, and sweeping the wings keeps them out of the shockwaves. This is why variable wings worked out. Lastly, think of drag like costing fuel. A plane affected by drag needs to use more fuel to stay at the same speed, so less drag means more fuel, which means a plane can stay in the air for longer. So that's it really. All of the advantages of variable wings without any of the downsides. Voigt was brought to the US under Operation Paperclip when the US took a bunch of German scientists, many of them were bona fide Nazis, by the way, and brought them to America. This is how Werner von Braun ended up working for NASA. And speaking of NASA, they decided to explore Voigt's oblique wing concept and developed it further into the AD-1, which underwent test flights in 1979 through 1982. So, how did it work? Well, you probably detected the pattern for this video by now. As you can tell from just looking at this thing, the aerodynamics of the plane are thrown out of whack by the asymmetrical design. The control of the plane was incredibly difficult, almost as much as the forward-swept wings we talked about earlier. This was to be expected, considering the airflow was doing opposite things to each side of the plane and was mostly solved with a flight computer that could compensate with other controls. It did rather limit the plane's role, however. You're not going to be dogfighting in this thing. Lastly, it was clear that if the plane ever lost control, it would be incredibly difficult to regain it due to the awkward wing configuration. So, not much came from the AD-1, but NASA did acquire a suite of useful data from many of the tests that it ran. And, well, it also never crashed. In fact, it's currently on display at a museum in California. So I guess that's something. These were just 5 examples of how designs in aviation have been explored beyond their traditional constraints. In a sense, it's fitting that aeronautics is one of the more imaginative fields of engineering, since the concept of human flight takes a little bit of imagination. Maybe someday we'll have designs that we can't even imagine today, taking us to skies unknown. So I really hope you found today's video super interesting. If you did, please do utilize that like button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Suggestions for future videos, use the comments below. And thanks for watching.